Hello, and welcome to the ADE Spotlight Podcast. My name is Jim Haggerty. As a provider of substance abuse assessments and client management databases, we have the privilege to work with terrific partners across the United States and Canada. In this series, we plan to talk to some of our colleagues about their work in the field of substance abuse assessment, prevention, and treatment. By sharing knowledge and experiences, it is my hope that we can all learn from each other. What we have learned, what the challenges are now and in the future, and how the ever-evolving technology impacts our work. ADE remains committed to working with our partners and using our experience with both substance use assessment and technology to provide the tools our colleagues rely on. As we learn from each other, we improve the value of our services. My guest this morning is Stephen Shelton. Stephen is an attorney in private practice in Fenton, Michigan, and he practices law throughout the state of Michigan. Over the last 10 years, he has represented hundreds of clients in criminal cases, ranging from minor misdemeanors to major felony charges. Stephen has also been named one of Michigan's elite super lawyers by other attorneys in Michigan for 4 years running. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Stephen, and I appreciate your time.
Oh, I'm glad to do it. Thank you for inviting me.
You have an interesting motivation for getting into law. Can you talk a little bit about what prompted you to go to law school and pursue this course?
Well, I've always had this kind of split personality. As you're probably aware, I was in radio for a very, very long time. But I also had this kind of, I referred to it as my nerdy dark side, where, I was always interested in kind of the more intellectual pursuits. And growing up, I grew up in a lot of little small towns where I was frequently the only person not related to everyone else. And so I kind of understood what it's like to be discriminated against. And so I always had an interest in that. And, for instance, when I was in college, I was involved in my campus's chapter of the ACLU, and I was president of the Amnesty International chapter. So I always had this kind of real interest in constitutional rights and civil rights and protecting the rights of people. And when deregulation hit radio and, the number of companies that owned radio stations went from a few hundred down to about 6, and they started firing people left and right, and there were really no more jobs in radio, I said, you know what, it's probably time that I indulged a more intellectual side of my personality, and I went to law school.
And what type of law do you practice now? What makes up your caseload?
I do primarily criminal defense work. I do some other things too. I do, a little bit of wills. I do some civil litigation. I do a fairly significant amount of appeals, both civil and criminal, although mostly it's criminal work. And then at my firm, we have another attorney who works for me who handles real property law, and she does estate planning and business law and things like that. So it's a mix, but probably half or more of what I do, probably significantly more than half of what I do is criminal defense work.
The reason that I'm excited about this talk is we're doing a series of podcasts related to DUI offenses, drug offenses, impaired driving offenses, that sort of thing. We're talking to treatment providers, we're talking to educators, we're talking to prevention specialists, and I thought it would be worthwhile to have the perspective of an attorney who works with individuals who find themselves in the unfortunate situation of being in the court system for a DUI or drug-related offense. I think that'll be an interesting perspective to have. So that's sort of the basis for this conversation here. So I'm interested chiefly in DUI and drug-related offenses. What percentage of your clients are struggling with those issues?
Well, if you look overall, if under the broad category of drug-related or alcohol-related, I would say, well over half of the cases that I'm involved in have some kind of connection to drug or alcohol use. A much smaller portion of that is related to driving. I guess about 15% of my total criminal cases, 15 to 20%, probably involve drunk driving or driving under the influence of drugs or something related to that.
Do you see that number increasing or decreasing over the years?
It has been the number of people who, again, it depends on whether you're talking the larger issue of somehow drug related, directly or indirectly, or you're talking about drinking and driving or drug use and driving related cases. If you're talking about specifically driving-related infractions, it has dropped a lot. When I first started out several years ago, I would get sometimes 7 or 8 calls a month from people who were arrested on drinking and driving related charges or driving while under the influence of drug charges. It has fallen substantially to the point where I probably get 3 or 4 calls a month on those, and then I end up being retained on 1 or 2 of those a month. So it has dropped pretty dramatically mostly in the last couple of years, to be honest.
Our research supports that as well. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the biggest part of it really is just the public perception. When I was growing up, it was right before they changed the driving age to 20, or the drinking age to 21 as well. And so it wasn't unusual even in high school to have seniors in high school talking about how they went to this, big party, and they drove home and they were drunk and they barely made it home without driving the car off the side of the road, and everybody thought it was a cute story. But groups got involved in this because it is a dangerous activity, and people were far too glib about it. And so you had these groups get involved, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Students Against Drunk Driving, and they did a really good job of making people aware that this isn't something that's funny and to be joked about or to brag about. This is actually a very, very serious problem, and people get hurt and people get killed. And not a few, quite a lot of them do. It's extremely dangerous behavior. Now, to a certain extent, I would argue that they may have gone overboard on that. However, definitely it was successful in making people realize that drinking and driving is a seriously dangerous thing to do, and that, you may not even realize how much you've had to drink before you get into a situation where it's potentially dangerous. And so I think that change in attitude towards drinking and driving has really had the most to do with the change in people's behaviors and whether or not they're going to get arrested for it. I've heard people say, well, it's because the police aren't looking for people as much as they were, and I find that to be absolutely not true. Literally, 90% of the clients I deal with who were involved in some kind of traffic stop, they found that the police were trying to, trap them into saying something that would lead them to a potential, alcohol or drug-related while driving charge. And, if they weren't involved in that kind of activity, then, ultimately it's unsuccessful. But it's not because police aren't trying to get people on these charges. I think it's because the number of people who are engaging in this kind of behavior has fallen dramatically.
I think there may be some truth to that. There may be some truth also to the fact that there are less police on the road. I think, with the economic downturn over the past 5 or 7 years, I think that the enforcement is down because there are less police on the road in some cases. It may be as simple as that.
I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, there are still... I haven't noticed a big change in the number of people who are being stopped. What I have noticed is a big change in the number of people who are being arrested on drunk driving or drugged driving related type charges. So I haven't seen a real change in the number of stops. What I've seen is just a big change in the nature of the charges that come out of those stops.
Let's talk about those that are stopped that then find themselves charged with a DUI offense. One of the things that we see elsewhere, some of the reports that I get from some of the people we deal with around the country, is that there is an increased likelihood that the initial charges, which may be a DUI or an OUI or whatever the local term for it may be, that in many cases these are being now pled down to some lesser offense that doesn't result in the harsher penalties that may come along with a DUI. Do you see that in your day-to-day work?
I see some of that, but not as much as you would think, and quite honestly, not as much as I would like from my perspective. And I think it's very specific to the jurisdiction, because the laws, of course, vary greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The laws in Michigan are vastly different than the laws in, say, Oklahoma or Ohio or Georgia or New York. In Michigan, what we frequently see on a first offense basis is we have two different things. We have what's called operating under the influence of liquor, which is OUIL, and we have operating while visibly impaired. Operating while visibly impaired doesn't require a specific blood alcohol content. It's what a reasonable person looking at this individual think, maybe they've been drinking. The operating under the influence of liquor charge, on the other hand, requires that there be, a .08 blood alcohol content or higher. So a lot of times what the best we can do in most jurisdictions is if we've got somebody who's got an operating under the influence of liquor charge, the .08 threshold, we can often get that knocked down to an operating while visibly impaired on a first offense. Now, why that's significant is it lowers the maximum fines by a couple of $100, and more significantly, what it does is it allows the person to have a restricted license for the entire time that their license is impinged upon as a result of the conviction. For instance, if you get an OUIL, you have a 6-month suspension of your license, and after the first certain amount of time, I can never remember off the top of my head, I think it's 30 days, you can have a restricted license. You can go to work, to medical appointments, to court, and to school. But for that first period of time on an OUIL, you cannot drive at all for any reason. Whereas if you knock it down to an operating while visibly impaired, for that entire time you have 90 days in which you have a restricted license. Now, you can't drive to the store, you can't drive to the movies, but you can drive to work, you can drive to school, you can drive to medical appointments, and you can drive to court. And that's a pretty significant difference between the two. Now, when you get to a second offense or a third offense, that distinction doesn't really matter at all, because an operating while visibly impaired second offense has the exact same penalties as an operating under the influence of liquor second offense, and the same for a third offense. So the most we can usually do is get the prosecutor to knock it down to an operating while visibly impaired on a first offense. Second and third offenses, most prosecutors in Michigan at least have a no deals policy. Even if the assistant prosecutor who's working on the case thinks, this is a bad case, it should be knocked down to something else, or there's some kind of, mitigating factor. For instance, the person had been drinking and, somebody got hurt and they were trying to drive them to the hospital or something. They can't do it because the county prosecutor, who is elected, of course, doesn't want to have, this reputation as, well, this person, this prosecutor is easy on drunk driving charges. So on second and third offenses, typically we don't get any kind of an offer. It's either go to trial or plead straight up. First offenses, we can usually get it knocked down somewhat, but it is virtually impossible to get it to something that is not alcohol related. In Michigan, we also have a thing called super drunk for a first offense, and that is if you have a blood alcohol content that is higher than double the normal rate. So if it's or the minimum rate for an operating under the influence of liquor. So if they have a .16 or above, that's what they call a super drunk. And on the super drunk cases, if you're convicted, you have, the ignition interlock is required. There are harsher penalties. The suspension is more difficult. All of those things happen to you. And on those cases, a lot of times, and it varies widely, but there's basically three approaches. One is they say absolutely no deals on those. They treat them like a second or third offense. Most places will say what we will do is on a super drunk, we will allow you to have a standard operating under the influence of liquor without the super drunk enhancement, but no visibly impaired. And the third approach, which is pretty rare, is they will still let you do a visibly impaired, but then typically they'll say, but we have to have a sentencing agreement that the defendant has to do A, B, C, and D, which is not normally required of somebody who has a drunk driving related offense. Now that's Michigan. It may be different in other places, and I'm sure it is. But when it comes to drunk driving offenses, prosecutors do not like to make really big deals. The best that we can do, and what we call a win most of the time, is if we can get it knocked down to a visibly impaired on a first offense, because that still allows the person to drive to work, and that's what most people's major concern is.
That concept of the super drunk law is interesting. You may not know this, but is that unique to Michigan? Do other states have similar kinds of super drunk laws?
I know that a few states do. I don't know how common it is because, I only practice in Michigan, so I couldn't tell you nationally how common that is. I do know that a few other states have it.
Yeah. You brought up another interesting point, too, about the jurisdiction. There was a fairly high-profile DUI arrest here in Michigan a while back. It was a an athlete was arrested for a DUI, and as part of the conversation, the argument was raised that because he was arrested in a certain area, he received more favorable treatment than he would have received had he been arrested somewhere else. So how much does jurisdiction matter in terms of where I'm arrested?
Well, that's kind of more of a venue question in some ways because it's still the same laws. And it matters a lot. In fact, it matters, the biggest significance when I'm dealing with cases is whether it ended up being, prosecuted by, say, a city attorney or a county prosecutor. Because city attorneys are much more willing to work on most of these cases than are county prosecutors. And I think the reason for that is politics. County prosecutors are elected, of course, at least in Michigan. And like I said, we have groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving who are very active in, endorsing or campaigning against prosecutors and putting a lot of pressure on prosecutors to be super tough on drunk driving related cases. And so no prosecutor that I'm aware of is brave enough to say, wait a second, maybe you guys are going a little too far. You're labeling everybody who gets pegged on one of these cases as, the scum of the earth. And maybe there are times when somebody deserves a little bit more of a break. Politicians are not well known for their courage. And so county prosecutors are a lot more likely to take a very tough stance on these cases, whereas city attorneys are typically contracted. They're not elected. And they have a lot more discretion, and they have a lot more ability to look at a case on an individual basis and say, this is a situation where maybe this person, was over the legal limit, but they were literally driving 3 driveways down the road to their house. It was 4 a.m. There was no one else on the road. The only reason that they got found was a police officer just happened to be driving by and saw them, or an angry ex-wife called and said, they're driving drunk or something along those lines. And a city attorney has a little bit more leeway to deal with that. And the city attorneys also have a little bit more leeway to deal with some of the collateral issues that come with it. If I have a client who has a commercial driver's license, a CDL, and they get a drunk driving case, basically their career is over. And sometimes a city attorney will be in a bit more of a position where they can say, when we can do something that will have the same fines, it'll have the same penalties, except it won't be reported to the Secretary of State as a moving violation for purposes of having license sanctions. A good example of that is there's something in Michigan called operating an off-road vehicle under the influence of drugs. It reads exactly the same as the drunk driving statute. The difference is it's intended for things where you don't have to have a driver's license and you're not on the road. Things like if you're driving a quad, four-wheeler through your field, in the back 40, or you're on a snowmobile out in the middle of a field or on a frozen lake where you don't have to necessarily have a driver's license and you're not on the road. That's what that statute's intended for. And sometimes you can get a city attorney who's willing to say, well, we'll charge it under this instead, so this person doesn't lose their license and lose their career. Usually you have to have a pretty sympathetic defendant to do something like that. But at least they have more of that freedom, whereas a prosecutor's office doesn't have that. Now, having said that, again, prosecutors are political. And sometimes if somebody is well-connected to the elected prosecutor, you can get up the elected prosecutor, and if the prosecutor thinks that it will work to their advantage politically, sometimes you can get them to make some kind of a deal. But that's pretty unusual. It definitely skirts on the gray edges, to put it kindly, of their ethical requirements. But sometimes that happens as well. So it does make a big difference as to where you're arrested and, more importantly, which agency it is that's prosecuting the case.
And you don't really have any control over that as the defendant's advocate, do you?
No, we don't have any control over who's prosecuting or where it's brought. Sometimes we can, but usually to go from bad to worse, not the other way around. There are ways I can get a case that's being prosecuted by the city prosecutor, sometimes taken to the county prosecutor instead, but usually that's not good news for my client if that happens, so we try to avoid it.
Let's talk about the laws then in general, and we can speak to the laws in Michigan because, of course, you would be well versed in that. You've been doing this for a number of years. Have the laws changed over the years, and if they have changed, have they become stricter?
They have changed a lot. Like the super drunk law is a relatively new law. It did not exist when I started practicing law, and it just came into effect a number of years ago. I can't remember how many years now, 5, 6, something along those lines. They're starting to realize, however, that maybe some of the punishments are a little too harsh and maybe counterproductive. One of the things that we have here in Michigan are driver responsibility fees, and they were implemented as part of this furor over, drunk drivers are horrible people and they should be punished as severely as we possibly can. And so in addition to the fines, in addition to the license sanctions, in addition to the other things that applied, if you had a drunk driving offense and you went to get your driver's license, every year you had to pay $1,000 in addition to the normal fee for your driver's license every single year for 2 or 3 years in order to get your license. If you had a operating while visibly impaired, it was $500. Well, the problem is, of course, that at the same time you were suspending people's driver's license. So they couldn't they had to drive to work to get the money to pay these fines, but if they had a suspended license, they couldn't drive to work. Well, the only way to get the license unsuspended was to pay the fines, yeah. Which they couldn't get, and it just created this circle. And then to make matters worse, in Michigan, if you get convicted of driving on a suspended license or really any kind of moving violation, while you have your license suspended or revoked, it takes that period of revocation or suspension and it tacks it on to the end of what your prior one was. So, I have one client who's not eligible now for a driver's license until 2021-12 because he's been picked up so many times on driving while license suspended because he couldn't pay those driver responsibility fees back in 2004 or whatever it was, but he has to work, so he keeps driving to work, and the only reason his license is suspended at this point was because he couldn't pay those driver responsibility fees. Now they've started to realize maybe this is not such a great idea, so Michigan is phasing out the driver responsibility fees. We started phasing them out towards the end of last year, and they will be completely gone by 2019. So that's kind of good news. But overall, they become a lot more strict. Now, a lot of the drinking and driving laws that we have on the state books were kind of mandated by the federal government. You remember, it used to be .10 in order to have a drunk driving. That was the threshold. Well, then the federal government came along and tied a lot of their road funding to what the drunk driving laws in the state said, and if the state wanted to be able to maintain their roads, they had to lower the threshold for a drunk driving case to .08. A lot of those laws have a sunset clause, however, and once that period of time runs out, it will go back up to .10. Typically, state legislatures are, moving to extend that and keep it down to a .08, but certainly outside of sentencing issues, they're not really doing much to restrict what happens with the initial threshold of being able to be charged and convicted on these kind of cases.
One of the things that I found interesting is Michigan has something called an implied consent law. Now, my limited understanding of this is that by virtue of having a driver's license, a driver then is giving consent for to have a breathalyzer test done at the time of a traffic stop or potential arrest, and if a driver refuses that, then there's a series of other sanctions that kick in. Do you think, or in your experience, are most people aware of this?
I don't think most people are aware of it, and it's something that a lot of people get confused on because they're under the assumption that you have certain rights. You have the right not to testify against yourself. You have the right to, not allow for a search of your car or your person, that sort of a thing. And people lump that into being part of that protection. But as you said, it's an implied consent law. And part of what it says in the state of Michigan is if you get a driver's license, you agree that you will submit to these breath tests. What happens is if you don't, your driver's license gets suspended, usually for about a year. Sometimes, honestly, it may be smarter to take that hit. If you know you've been drinking and you know that submitting to this test is just going to sink your ship, sometimes it's better to go ahead and take that hit on getting the suspended license and worry about it later, as opposed to getting yourself into a lot more trouble with a drunk driving charge. But most people are not aware of this, and it gets a lot of people into trouble because the police will also. I don't know if they're necessarily abusing the law or if they don't understand it themselves. But a lot of times police will, try to threaten someone that they have to submit to these preliminary breath tests, these PBTs, even if they're not driving. They had a problem with this in East Lansing a while back, where students walking along campus were being approached by police officers who said, "You look like you've been drinking below this tube, but we're going to suspend your driver's license."
Is that right?
And they can't do that. So it does create a little bit of confusion. The intent is, of course, to make it easier to catch drunk drivers. And I think it's probably effective in that regard, but I think that it also creates a trap for a lot of people who are just trying to stand up for their rights and don't understand the distinction.
I understand the logic in your answer when you say that some people should, they may be aware of it, but they should take the hit because it may be in their best interest to do so. I understand that. I guess I would be more concerned about people who believe they have the right to refuse it when in fact they may not, and then find out later that because they refused, they have this additional sanction.
Right, and the police, before they do this, they're supposed to read this statement to you that tells you have the right to refuse it, but if you refuse, your license is going to be suspended and all of these things. But the problem is that when I don't know about you, but I've been pulled over a couple of times, and even though I'm a criminal defense attorney, I still get nervous when I get pulled over by the police, and when that happens, you're not thinking straight, and this is especially true if it's 3 o'clock in the morning on the side of the road when it's 12 degrees below zero, and you're tired, and now you've got this police officer who is probably trying to intimidate you. At that point, the adrenaline starts running. People don't start thinking clearly, and the fight or flight instinct kicks in, and either they become very submissive or they become very defiant. And that's where you get a lot of these problems where people don't understand what it is that they're doing. They don't understand that either they have the right to say no, but their license is going to be suspended most likely, or where they just submit to it, not realizing they don't have to. So the problem is that people have to make that decision on their own, usually when they're not in a great state of mind to make any kind of decision, and that's kind of a bad formula.
The conversation I have with the people that we work with across the country, and whether they're working in a probation department or whether they're a private agency, is when we're looking at these DUI offenses or these drug-related offenses, and that is walking the line between multiple lines, I suppose, between punishing the individual for breaking the law, protecting the public at large, providing some public safety, as well as then assessing and treating the individual. It seems like we're juggling these three concepts. When we, in your experience, when you have somebody who finds themselves in this position, are we doing enough to look at the individual, do a complete assessment on the individual, decide whether or not or at what level they need some sort of intervention, some sort of treatment? Are we doing enough there?
That varies a lot from place to place. In Michigan, for a long time, the focus has been almost entirely on punishing the individual. A lot of it was justified in the language of public safety, but really it was about punishment. There wasn't really a whole lot that was done in terms of, really assessing whether or not the person needed some kind of treatment. I say that as a very blanket statement. It varies greatly from place to place. I can give you a couple of examples. My office is in Fenton. We have a district court here in Fenton, and the judge we have at this district court is one of the best judges I know. He looks at every case individually. He doesn't just cookie cut every single case. Everybody who has this charge gets this and this and this. And to make matters even better, there's a probation officer who works with that court, who's one of the better probation officers that I've ever worked with, and he really does do a good good assessment of people. We often talk in criminal defense that there are two kinds of people who become probation officers. There are people who like to bully people, but for some reason couldn't get a job as a guard or a police officer, and so they became probation officers because they like to boss people around. Or you have people who, want to be social workers. And the latter is actually much better because they, especially in these kind of cases, because they're much more concerned about whether or not, this person is getting what they need to avoid being back in this position again, as opposed to the former kind of person who just wants to, hammer this person as often as they can, just because they can. And so in this court that we have here locally, where I practice quite a bit, we have a probation officer who will sometimes, and not infrequently, he'll assess somebody's situation. He'll actually say to the judge, I don't think this person needs anything. I think this was somebody who, went out. They're not somebody who drinks a lot. They didn't understand the impact it would have on them when they drank this. It's not something they're going to do again. I don't think you need to send them to any kind of treatment. And usually the judge follows that recommendation. Then we have other judges in other parts of the state who are pretty notorious. We have one that's a county over from us who used to send kids to jail on minor in possession charges. You have a little bit of alcohol when you're under 21. The state statute of Michigan doesn't even allow a judge to send a defendant to jail on that charge. But these judges were doing it anyway. And when they had a drunk driving case, they were sentencing people to jail very first time out. They were, making them do ridiculous amounts of alcohol and drug testing. You may have been driving for 30 years and never had even so much as a speeding ticket, but you pick up one drunk driving charge and you're at a .08, just at the very, very edge of the limit. And they're making you drug and alcohol test 5 times a week. You're having to go to AA 3 times a week. You're having to do all these other things that, didn't really do anything positive or didn't accomplish anything for a person who isn't a regular drinker, who just went out one time and, probably got into the situation because they're not a regular drinker. So it varies a lot. Recently, I've noticed that there's been a bit more of a trend to get away from just hammering people on this, and more courts are being a bit more individual-centered. But really, a lot of it depends on the judge and it depends on the probation officer. For instance, I have a case right now in a nearby county where my client was convicted of an assault. He threw something at his, ex-wife's new husband. And there's a longer story. It was a more complicated situation than that, but that's what he ended up pleading to. There was no indication he was involved in any kind of drugs or alcohol. There was no indication of anything related to those, but they're still making him drug tests and alcohol tests twice a week. So that's kind of a pointless exercise, and the cynical part of me says, well, we've got a lot of these places that do private drug testing or that do these kinds of places that are making some campaign donations to judges. And maybe that's influencing a little bit. We had that situation in Pennsylvania a couple years ago where there was a private prison complex and they were literally bribing judges to sentence children to prison when the children, were clearly probation candidates, or even if they weren't probation candidates, they should have been put in a more specialized youth kind of place. But they were sending them to prison because they were getting kickbacks from the prison company. And there's a cynical part of me that says there's some of that happening in a lot of these places too, just maybe not as blatant.
Do you think, though, that we've been talking about DUI offenses primarily here, but let's talk about things like domestic violence. Let's talk about things like financial crimes or shoplifting. At least in your opinion, is there a need to at least look at whether or not substance use or abuse may have been a factor in these cases?
Oh, absolutely there is. Absolutely there is. Here's one thing I can tell you. Anytime I get a retail fraud involving a large amount of items, or a home invasion, or certain kinds of other theft charges, especially when they're like what we have in Michigan called uttering and publishing, which is basically forging checks. The first thing I always ask my client is, so what's your heroin habit like? And 9 times out of 10, they'll come back and say, oh, I'm using a couple packs a day. Theft crimes, for the most part, not little stuff like, maybe a little shoplifting, but major theft crimes, home invasions, things like that, tend to be motivated, at least in the part of Michigan where I'm located, by heroin addiction and methamphetamine and crack addiction. Mostly heroin addiction at this point. It used to be, years and years ago, it was crack, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Now heroin is kind of the big thing. And as soon as I get one of those cases, almost the first question I ask my client, how much heroin you use? And they say, a couple packs a day. So that is what underlies a lot of the theft-related crimes. Violent crimes like assault, domestic violence, things like that, there tends to be less drugs like heroin or cocaine or anything like that involved. There does tend to be a lot of alcohol involved in those cases. So much so that some judges and some prosecutors just assume that if there is a domestic violence case that alcohol is involved. And that's an unwarranted assumption. It's not nearly as high of an influence as, say, the heroin is on major theft kind of cases. But it definitely does get involved a lot. I get a lot of cases, probably about half of them, where, spouses or boyfriend, girlfriend, or what have you, are drinking while they're having an argument and things escalate. Now, the one thing I will tell you is I've never had an assault-related case related to marijuana. People who start drinking get angry and they, start to think that they're superheroes and they can, take on anybody they want to. People who are smoking marijuana when they get angry just decide they're not going to share anymore. And that's kind of how they get back at people. So I've never had an assault case involving marijuana, but I've had a lot of them involving alcohol.
I want to, Stephen, I want to circle back to marijuana in just a minute, but you touched on heroin as a factor in some of these cases that you deal with. And now Michigan is not unique. The use of heroin is on the rise. Heroin-related death is on the rise. And that's a whole other topic. I think we could probably talk for quite a long time about that. Just in a general sense, when you find that to be true, and I'm hearing you say you find that to be true fairly often, that these crimes are motivated in part by the need to support an addiction to heroin or OxyContin or some drug like that. Does that change how you advocate for your client when you go into the courtroom?
It does. It does quite a bit because, the problem that we're going to have is if I've got a client who's a heroin addict and they're up on a theft charge, they're going to be back on another charge. And it may not even be, far in the future. I'm thinking of a specific client of mine who I had who was up on a bad check scheme case. And that particular client she was being held without bond, but she ended up being released because the county jail was overcrowded. While she was released, she got arrested not once, not twice, but 3 times for stealing flat screen TVs from Walmart, all because she needed to support her heroin habit. This is while she's already out on bond on another case. and then they arrest her on the new shoplifting case for stealing the TVs. The judge puts her out on the street. A week later, she does the same thing. Judge puts her out on the street. 2 days later, she does the same thing in a different Walmart. This was somebody whose problem wasn't that she was greedy. Her problem wasn't that she really, really liked having flat screen TVs. Her problem was that she had a monkey on her back, and she needed money to support that habit to keep herself from getting sick.
In a very sort of global picture here, does the criminal justice system, at least from your viewpoint, understand this and treat these individuals accordingly?
I think that they understand it. I think they're having a hard time grasping how to treat it accordingly, because it's not a simple problem. It's kind of a cliche, but it's true. A person who's got an addiction problem has to want to get over their addiction problem before you're going to make any progress. And the courts, that's really beyond the ability of the courts to make somebody want to do that. They can punish the person, they can lock them up, they can try to make things as miserable for them as they can in hopes that what that's going to do is convince them that the only way out of this is to want to change. But quite frankly, a lot of times all it does is it drives them further into addiction, because they're upset, so what do they do to feel better? They put a needle in their arm. That change has to come from inside, and I don't know that, honestly, a court has the ability to make that kind of change. What one client told me one time, she was being completely honest, and it totally opened my eyes. She said, "I'm going to tell you something." She goes, "I love my heroin more than I love my children. And they can take away my children, and I will be very upset, and I'll be very sad, but I can always go out and score more heroin."
I'm not surprised to hear that, based on my experience working in this field for so long. And again, this is just part of that conversation about balancing punishment versus public safety versus the needs of the individual. It's just an ongoing conversation. I used to say, rather flippantly, I think, that nobody gets into treatment on their own, is how I should say it. They're getting pressure from somewhere, what I would call the 4 L's, either my liver, my lover, my livelihood, or the law. One of those things is at my back pushing me into this. So it's just this is just an ongoing conversation. But let's circle back now to marijuana. There's some real momentum for legalizing recreational marijuana across the country, and as we have discussed here in Michigan. So let's can you tell me a little bit about your experience with that and what you see the challenges are going forward?
Well, I should start out by saying I'm all in favor of legalizing it, quite honestly. I see a lot of economic benefits to it. I quite honestly don't think it will have a tremendous impact in the number of people who use marijuana. I know a lot of people who you would never suspect who go out and smoke marijuana. So I don't think it will have a huge impact on the number of people who use it. I think what it will have a huge impact on is the number of people who have criminal convictions as a result of using it. And it'll have a huge impact on how much money we have in state budgets. Colorado is experiencing a big economic boon from having legalized recreational marijuana, for instance. And I think that that's a model that more states should be looking at. From a practical perspective, like I said earlier, I have never once had a case involving an assault where the person who committed the assault was using marijuana. I can't say the same about alcohol. Alcohol tends to trigger angry drunks. Angry marijuana users just, give you a bad look and say, "I'm not going to share anymore." In terms of the challenges that we're going to have, one of the challenges we won't have for sure if this happens is we won't have any problems, I don't think, at least to the extent that we have them now, we're not going to have the problems with jail crowding that we have. There is a vastly inordinate number of people who are being held in jails and prisons on marijuana-related charges of one type or another. You free up those beds, you free up a lot of space for people who actually are doing something very dangerous. One of the problems that we might have, and we're already dealing with this because, like I said, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference in terms of usage rates. We're going to have issues dealing with things like driving while under the influence of marijuana. Now, we already have laws on that in some of these states. Will it increase the number of people who are doing it slightly? Maybe slightly, but I don't think it'll be a huge change. I don't think that we're going to have a huge number of changes in our law to deal with it. What we will probably have to, quite honestly, deal with is how to change the attitudes of law enforcement and probation officers and judges. The biggest problem that we've had in Michigan with our medical marijuana law is we have judges and probation officers who want to practice medicine. You've got a defendant who's got some kind of debilitating disease, for instance, might have HIV, and they're taking a lot of drugs to treat that medical condition. Well, those drugs can cause someone to be very, very sick. I had a client who absolutely, was essentially bedridden because of the drugs he had to take because of his HIV status. But when he smoked marijuana, he was able to function. He was able to get out of bed. He was able to keep food down, and he held down a very, very nice job. He had a lot of responsibilities, had to do a lot of travel, oversaw a big staff, and he did it all very well as long as he could smoke marijuana to kind of alleviate the symptoms of the other treatment he was experiencing. In fact, it's interesting. Earlier this week, there was a study released. I believe it was the University of Michigan conducted the study that said that people who use medical marijuana after they've been diagnosed with some kind of a debilitating medical condition will use 64% less opiates. They're trading in these drugs that are harsher, that are more addictive, and they're getting much better relief from something that is easier to obtain, that is not quite as harsh, and doesn't have all of the side effects. But the problem we have is we have judges all over the state who will tell defendants, I don't care what your situation is, I don't care if your doctor says this is appropriate for you, while you're on probation for this shoplifting or this domestic assault or this failing to change lanes for a police officer parked at the side of the road, you are not going to use your medical marijuana. And if you do, I'm going to put you in jail. We have police officers who essentially treat everybody who has some marijuana, even if they have a medical marijuana card that says that they can have it, as if they're junkies. They assume that everyone's just a stoner who's looking for an excuse to use it. And I don't think that the 68-year-old grandmother who had glaucoma that I talked with last week, who was facing charges of manufacture of marijuana because she had some marijuana growing in her basement. I'm pretty sure she wasn't a pusher. But that's how they treat everyone. They really, I think, don't understand that 2/3 of the voters in Michigan approved this law. And what they're doing is they're trying to undermine the will of the electorate. And that's not their job. Their job is to deal with justice. Their job is to deal with enforcing the laws that is written, not to enforce the law to a harsher degree than it is written. And unfortunately, that's the attitude that a lot of judges and law enforcement officers and probation officers have. And that's going to be the biggest thing we're going to have to deal with.
This is going to be very fascinating to watch. There is still, as you say, there are attitudes that are against the idea of legalizing marijuana. I saw a blurb today, I believe it was on Twitter, about some study that came out that said that marijuana is more harmful to the brain chemistry than alcohol. So I think there's still an argument on both sides. It's going to be fascinating to watch over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But attitudes can change very quickly. I think just from a sociological perspective, in my lifetime, there's been very few things that have moved as fast as this. I guess I think specifically of marriage equality. I thought the attitudes about marriage equality changed rather quickly in the last 5 years or so, and we may see that.
Yeah, that is absolutely true, and we're seeing a lot of that. Like you said, they're seeing a lot of the same thing in terms of people, recognizing that there may be some legitimate use for things like marijuana, and maybe. If we're going to allow alcohol to be legal, which, we tried to outlaw at one point, and that didn't really work very well. It worked well for Al Capone, but not for a whole lot of other people. But, maybe we need to look at, we can outlaw this, but should we? And I think a lot of times we have laws that are on our books simply because legislators said, we can, and they didn't bother to ask if we should. And I think that's a large part of what's happening now. I think a lot of people are starting to ask that more important question, well, should we? Should we make these laws that throw a lot of people into jail and into prison for when it comes down to it, are very, very minor infractions? Is this whole war on drugs thing all it's cracked up to be? Is it really accomplishing what we want, or is it actually making the situation worse? And I'm seeing a lot of people, especially in recent years, really come back and start to say, maybe this isn't working. Maybe we need to take a new approach. And I think that's what's really going to spur a lot of these changes.
It's going to be very interesting to watch. Stephen, I want to thank you for spending the time with me this morning. I learned a lot. I've enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully we'll do it again.
It's always a pleasure, and I'd be happy to come back.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the ADE Spotlight Podcast. I hope you found it insightful. If you have any comments, suggestions for future topics, or would like to be featured in an upcoming episode, please let us know. You may reach us by email at support@adeandcorp.com.